Congruent. Exactly the same. How can we say that the two triangles are congruent? Yan ang pag-uusapan natin ngayon dito sa ating matsayang talakayan. Kaya, stay tuned! Hello grade 8 learners! For today's video, we will discuss congruent triangles. At the end of this lesson, you will be able to illustrate triangle congruence. Before we begin, let us take a look on these figures. Which pairs of figures are congruent? If you say figure A and G, then you are correct. If you say D and I, excellent, you are correct. If you say figure E and figure J, then you are correct. And another is, if you have C and H, then you are correct. We can see a lot of congruent figures around us. Let us take a look on these figures. From these given figures, how can we say that the two figures are congruent? Certain objects or figures are congruent if they have the same size and the same shape. And at the same time, one object can be made to coincide with the other. Anong ibig sabihin nito? So let us observe. Halimbawa, gamitin natin ang ating mga kamay. So, let our hands coincide with each other. Ibig sabihin, gamitin natin yung right hand, itapat natin sa left hand. Make sure that each fingers corresponds with each other. Meaning, yung index finger sa right hand should be paired with the index finger sa left hand. And yung thumb natin sa right hand should be paired to the thumb of the left hand. Okay? So just like this. Anong ibig sabihin? That our hands, when coincide with each other, they are considered as congruent. Let us use that idea in triangles. We are going to pair triangle ABC and triangle XYZ. So what will happen? Mapapansin natin that triangle ABC exactly overlap with triangle XYZ. Ibig sabihin that these two triangles have the same shape and with the same size. In pairing triangles, we have what we call correspondence between two triangles. A one-to-one correspondence can be established between the vertices of two given triangles. Okay, so using the figure halimbawa, in triangle ABC and triangle XYZ, yung point A or vertex A can be paired with vertex X. Then, vertex B can be paired with vertex Y. And vertex C can be paired with vertex Z. This pairing up of vertices can be described by the symbol for correspondence, and this is the symbol that we can use. So, we can say that ABC corresponds to XYZ. This means that A corresponds with X, B corresponds with Y, and C corresponds with Z. In the correspondence, there are 3 pairs of corresponding angles and 3 pairs of corresponding sides. So using the given figure, the corresponding angles are angle A corresponds to angle X, angle B corresponds to angle Y, and angle C corresponds to angle Z. And the corresponding sides are side AB corresponds to side XY, side AC corresponds to side XZ, and side BC corresponds to side YZ. Now, congruence correspondence. The vertices of the first triangle are paired up with the vertices of the second triangle in such a way that the corresponding angles and the corresponding sides are congruent. When the corresponding angles and the corresponding sides are congruent, we can say that two triangles are congruent, which have the same size and the same shape, meaning that the first triangle fits exactly over the second triangle. So, in the figure, with the correspondence a while ago, we can have the corresponding congruent parts. So we have corresponding congruent angles. Angle A is now congruent to angle X. Angle B is congruent to angle Y. And angle C is congruent to angle Z. Now, with the corresponding congruent sides, side AB is congruent to side XY. Then, AC is congruent to XZ. And BC congruent to YZ. What does correspondence implies? If the correspondence between two pairs of two triangles are congruent, then we say that two triangles are congruent. So anong ibig sabihin nito? Masasabi natin that the two triangles are congruent kapag ang kanyang mga corresponding parts ay congruent. So halimbawa, meron tayong triangle GMA and triangle CBN. So paano natin maipapakita that these two triangles are congruent? So, we are going to show that the corresponding angles are congruent and the corresponding sides are congruent. Para maipakita natin in the figure, gagamit tayo ng arcs and tick marks. Parts with the same arcs and tick marks are the parts which are congruent. So let's say we have angle G and angle C. So these two angles are congruent. Then, angle M congruent to angle B. And angle A congruent to angle N. Then we have the corresponding congruent sides using tick marks. We have side GM and side BC. We have side MA congruent to side BN. And side AG congruent to side NC. Since naipakita na natin that the corresponding parts of the triangles are congruent, then we can now say that triangle GMA and triangle CBN are congruent. Let us now show that triangle ABC and triangle DEF are congruent. So we are going to write the corresponding angles and the corresponding sides which are congruent. What do you think are the corresponding congruent angles of the two triangles? If you answered angle A congruent to angle D, then you are correct. If you answered angle C congruent to angle F, then you are correct. And if you answered angle B congruent to angle E, then you are correct. How about the corresponding congruent sides? So we have side BC congruent to side EF. Then, side AB congruent to side DE. And side AC congruent to side DF. Okay, now that we have shown the corresponding congruent parts, we can now say that the two triangles are congruent. In other words, we have the acronym CPCTC, which means corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Now, using the figure, let us complete the missing corresponding parts of the two triangles. What do you think is the angle corresponds to angle J? Correct. Angle N corresponds to angle J. So we can now say that angle J is congruent to angle N. How about angle K? Angle K corresponds to angle M. So therefore, angle K is congruent to angle M. How about angle JLK? Angle JLK corresponds to angle NLM. So we can say that angle JLK is congruent to angle NLM. Now, let's move on with the corresponding congruent sides. JK corresponds to NM. So, we can now say that JK is congruent to NM. KL corresponds to ML. So, we can now say that KL is congruent to ML. And JL corresponds to NL. So therefore, we can now say that JL is congruent to NL. Okay? Ngayon, dahil kumpleto na ang ating mga corresponding parts, the corresponding angles are congruent, the corresponding sides are congruent, so we can now say that the two triangles are congruent. So triangle JKL is now congruent to triangle NML. Now, let us draw and name the two congruent triangles with the given information using the corresponding congruent sides and the corresponding congruent angles. Of course, we need to have two congruent triangles. Name it as triangle PEN and triangle CIL. So let us use tick marks to show the congruent parts. So PE is congruent to CI, EN is congruent to IL, and PN is congruent to CL. Then, using arcs with tick marks, we can show congruent angles. Angle P is congruent to angle C. Angle E is congruent to angle I. And angle N is congruent to angle L. Okay? So this is now the illustration of the two congruent triangles. Now let us name the congruent triangles. Therefore, we can say that triangle PEN is congruent to triangle CIL. Kung meron tayong ibang pangalan ng triangle, pwede rin that triangle ENP congruent to triangle ILC. Or triangle NPE congruent to triangle LCI. Or triangle NEP congruent to triangle LIC. Or we have triangle PNE congruent to triangle CLI. And triangle EPN congruent to triangle ICL. So, ibig sabihin, maaari nating pangalanan yung mga congruent triangles natin depending on the corresponding parts. Ibig sabihin, let's say, P corresponds to C, E corresponds to I, and N corresponds to L. So kapag nagkabali-baliktad yung unang letters na nilagay mo sa pangalan ng triangle mo, isunod mo doon sa corresponding parts ng pangalawang triangle. And now, it's your turn. Get your pen and paper and do this activity. Name the corresponding congruent parts of the given figure and name the congruent triangles. And that's for today, guys. Do not forget to like, subscribe, and share. Again, this is Teacher Dali na nagsasabing, practice makes perfect. Thanks for watching!